Welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
Before we get started today, I just want to let you guys know that this episode is brought to you by Onnit. From their awesome fitness equipment to their ultra high quality health supplements, Onnit offers an entire range of products to help you become superhuman. Check them out at jle.vi/ONNIT and use the coupon code GETONIT for 10% off today. This episode is also brought to you by Fiverr, the world's largest marketplace for just about any outsourced or freelance service you can think of, all starting at only $5. Please support the show by visiting jle.vi/Fiverr with 2 R's today. Greetings, super friends, and welcome to this week's episode of the Becoming Superhuman podcast, where we talk about napping and ice and everything nice, or at least everything that will help you get the most out of your mind and body. In that vein, our guest today is a New York Times bestselling author of Beyond Training, Mastering Endurance, Health, and Life. Ooh, I love that title, you guys. He's also written about 30 other books on how to feel and become and look superhuman. He's been nominated as one of the top personal trainers in America and been voted among the top 100 most influential individuals in health and fitness for the last 2 years running. On top of all these wonderful accomplishments, he also runs one of the top-rated health and fitness podcasts on the web, where he continues to explore functional exercise, nutrition, and human performance overall. You've probably already seen him or his work on the Huffington Post, WebMD, Men's Health, Shape Magazine, NBC, Fox. The list goes on and on. I'm already tired of reading it. One of the things I enjoyed most about this interview, you guys, is that my guest does not talk down to you as an audience. He's direct, he's to the point, and he's not at all afraid to get technical and really hit you with some of the hard science. We talk about the ideal mix of exercises and movements for a healthy life. We talk about determining the right diet for you, supplementation, and generally just how to look, feel, and perform your best. And that is what this show is all about. It's a quick interview, but it's packed with knowledge. And just one caveat/apology, guys. The interview does have a very abrupt ending, as my guest and I were disconnected towards the end, and we ran out of time while trying to connect. With that said, we've edited it the best we can. You're not going to miss anything, but please forgive the less than polished ending. And now, let me introduce you to the man who literally wrote the book on becoming superhuman, Mr. Ben Greenfield. Mr. Ben Greenfield, welcome to the show, my friend. How are you doing?
I am doing well. I've just hopped off of a treadmill run at today was about 15,000 feet elevation.
Oh, wow.
With a hypoxic training mask on. So I'm recollecting my oxygen as we speak.
Oh, nice. We got you in the nice serotonin boost, a little bit of a runner's high, I imagine.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that. Did you know that when you train at altitude, you actually get a bigger serotonin boost than if you just train at, like normal elevation?
I did. It has a little bit to do with kind of the fight or flight response, doesn't it?
It has to do with that. It also has to do, I believe, with an increase in the amino acid tryptophan.
Ooh, that's interesting. Tryptophan is associated with kind of putting you to sleep normally.
Yeah, but in smaller amounts, it can actually increase serotonin and dopamine. So,
oh, that is interesting. And that I did not know. So very cool. And where do you get this? I imagine you're wearing one of these masks that reduces oxygen flow?
Yeah, it's hooked up to a HEPA air filter, and it's basically like a hypoxic air generator. It's made by a company called Hypoxico, and I keep it out in the garage by my treadmill. And I just qualified for the national championships for a hunting competition that's going to take place in Colorado Springs, which is definitely an elevation. So I've just started into my altitude training.
Interesting. And do you find that in your day-to-day, I mean, if you go to the gym and you do a workout, do you find you have much more endurance in regular altitude settings?
Yes, although with the caveat that I don't really go to the gym. But yeah,
I see. That's a good caveat.
Yeah, not a huge fan of gyms, just based off of everything from the endocrine disrupting perfumes and colognes that everybody in there is wearing to the Wi-Fi to the EMF to the off-gassing from the carpet to, gosh, gyms are not healthy places to hang out.
Oh, wow. That's very interesting. It sounds like you're much more sensitive than I realized to kind of inputs. I mean, colognes and things like that. Tell me about that a little bit.
I'm not sensitive to them. I mean, let me put it this way. I'm not any more sensitive than anybody else.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But the issue is that when you look at, for example, estrogen mimickers in the perfume of that lady running next to you on the treadmill and off-gassing from the carpet, and the fact that in a recent European study they found mold and fungus all over the locker rooms of a variety of gyms, there are a lot of issues. And then you have just the whole increase in carbon dioxide when you have a whole bunch of people shoved into a tiny little space. There are healthier places to spend your time. Now, let me give this caveat, though. If you have to choose between a gym versus nothing, the gym is still going to be more healthy, just like the studies that have been done on air pollution and the fact that running next to a polluted road is still healthier than not running at all. So it just comes down to if you are able to get to like a park to do a body weight workout or something like that, it's definitely better for you.
So you're more of an advocate of body weight than, say, heavyweight training?
No, not necessarily. For example, I've got 80-pound sandbags. I've got cinder blocks. I've got cinder blocks attached to chains. I've got extremely heavy tires that I got for free from the back of the local tire store. I mean, I have plenty of weight spread around my yard. It's just that it's not necessarily symmetrical, right? It's not attached to a barbell or a dumbbell. I do have a few kettlebells out there too. So I'm definitely a fan of loading the muscles because that's really, unless you're going to go to pure fatigue, right, in terms of inducing satellite cell growth and muscle fiber hypertrophy through enormous amounts of lactic acid from doing, say, a set of, let's say, 200 push-ups, which is just mentally difficult to do. I say, well, if you are going for something like hypertrophy in the chest, or if you are going for strength in the, like horizontal extension of the shoulder, then you could, for example, do a few tire flips or even lay on your back with a heavy sandbag and do some pressing. And that type of thing is superior to body weight training if your goal really is to just get hella strong.
Sure. Yeah, I think you absolutely have to be thinking about slow twitch versus fast twitch muscles. And if you're going for the slow twitch endurance, those push-ups are going to be great. But if you want the strength and physique that fast twitch muscle affords, at some point you got to lift things that are much heavier than you are.
Yeah, it depends. There's more than one way to skin that cat, right? So, for example, you could do explosive push-ups, clap push-ups. You could do push-ups next to the stairs where every push-up you're moving your hands up the stairs. You can do decline push-ups where your hands are way lower than your feet to increase the amount of weight on your upper body. So there are ways that you can still pull off the body weight version and potentially even do it hard enough to where you're limiting yourself to 10 reps.
Absolutely. So Ben, I think one of the really interesting things is you and I both talk a lot about becoming superhuman, and you've actually titled a couple of your books, the Superhuman Food Pyramid, Become Superhuman, Raise Little Superhumans. I'm curious to hear what superhuman means to you, because I think you probably have a very unique definition around what it means to be physically superhuman.
I don't know if it is unique, but I'd say the definition that I throw around, and this is a total catchphrase, right? It'll probably sound like one, but I would say complete optimization of performance, fat loss, digestion, brain, sleep, and hormone optimization. Once you have all those things firing on all cylinders, you've generally got your bases covered. I would say probably the addition to that I've developed over the past couple of years would be that all of that is great, but in the absence of love and relationships and a strong spirit, that a lot of that can be for naught, or else it can be very passing or not give you the fulfillment that you'd think you'd have by having a superhuman physical makeup. So Bingo. I think that we can't neglect the spiritual and also the social component.
Bingo. When we started out this show, it was a lot of memory experts and a lot of physical performance experts. And over time, we kind of encountered, hey, we should do an episode on having good relationships. We should do an episode on emotional fulfillment and meditation. And pretty soon we found that it was more about balance, and that it all kind of falls apart if you don't have your social and emotional life in order.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly.
So let me ask this. I know you're most known for the physical aspects and the health aspects. So I'm curious if you could prescribe a one-size-fits-all kind of day-by-day fitness regimen for every day of the week. What mix of exercises or disciplines would it look like? And would there be any of the kind of mainstream yogas or CrossFits, or is it a lot of out there with tires and kettlebells doing your own thing?
Yeah, the tires and kettlebells thing is not necessary, right? Unless you are actually preparing for an athletic competition, which I do, right? I do obstacle racing, I do triathlon. I don't necessarily argue that it is healthy or necessary for a good program based around anti-aging, longevity, a nice body, etc. But I love to compete. It fulfills my deep-rooted desire to go out there and do battle. I know many people that don't really care to compete. They just want to feel good, they want to look good, and they want to live a long time. And that's great. And I certainly think that by going out and doing like Ironman triathlons or racing for 5 hours of Spartan racing out in the mountains, I don't necessarily think that that's making me healthier. But for me to be able to do that and to do it well, which is part of my identity, it's part of my business, it's part of what makes me happy, I have to have a lot of those external training variables that I don't necessarily think everyone needs to have. So when we step back and let's say we subtract the variable of competition, okay, you're not preparing for an Ironman or a big obstacle race, you're not a semi-pro or a pro tennis player or a baseball player or something like that. The crux of your program would be based around, first of all, number one, low-level physical activity during the time of day when your parasympathetic nervous system is primed for that type of low-level aerobic activity, preferably in a fasted state. So you are accelerating fat burning and preferably outdoors. So you're getting the sunlight exposure and that kind of jump start of your circadian rhythm. So based on that, I'm a big fan of morning time, easy walks, nature walks, yoga, Tai Chi, easy swimming, even cold water swimming if you can handle it without too much sympathetic nervous system activation, hot tubbing, which I do sometimes in the morning. Basically anything that allows for activity, blood flow, and lymph flow without stressing the sympathetic nervous system too intensively. Sprinting, hard running, heavy lifting, voluminous workouts, CrossFit WODs, etc., do not serve you best when done early in the morning.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, so that would be number one, okay? And you can do that, and I do that every day, literally, almost 365 days a year, 7 days a week. I'm doing some type of low-level physical activity, and it varies from week to week. Some days it's yoga, some days it's Tai Chi, some days it's swimming, some days it's walking, some days, I'll even do a little bit of bouldering or climbing because for me, that's almost like a mobility form of yoga. It really depends. But ultimately, the takeaway message is that A, it's aerobic and easy. B, preferably it's something that you find relaxing and restorative. C, preferably if you can, it's outdoors in the sunshine. And D, if you can do it in a fasted state, all the better, because then you're tapping into the benefits of intermittent fasting, but you're not moving extremely stressfully in that intermittent fasted state.
So that's a very interesting point as well, because I'm also a big proponent of intermittent fasting. It's something I've experimented with, not just for fat loss and kind of insulin control, but also for focus. Do you do intermittent fasting every day, or is it a once a week kind of thing?
365 days a year, I fast for 12 hours each day.
Wow. Okay. So 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. kind of thing?
Generally, for me, it's closer to about a 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. until 9 a.m. or 10 a.m.-ish.
Interesting.
And that's simply because our family eats late. Like usually we'll start dinner around 8:30 p.m.
Sure. And walk the audience through, we have talked a little bit about the insulin regulation and stuff like that, but why do you feel that that's so important for fat loss, and how does that work?
Intermittent fasting?
Yes.
Primarily via cellular apoptosis, right? Cleanup of cellular debris, a decrease in the rate at which your telomeres shorten based on the fact that you are not constantly stressing your digestive system, your mitochondria, and your metabolism by churning glucose and fatty acids through that cycle.
And it's important to note you're hydrating just as much as normal during that period, correct?
Yeah, it's kind of blown out of proportion, the whole hydration thing. But yeah, I drink water. I even drink coffee before that morning fasted session to mobilize more fatty acids.
Ah, interesting.
Green tea, pu'er tea, anything like that. So ultimately, though, that's kind of like the first, shall we say, pillar of the type of movement protocol that you asked about.
Okay. The
second thing would be low-level physical activity all day long. So you either have a job that is gardening, farming, building walls, construction, whatever, which some people do, or else you hack your environment to simulate that by using things like standing workstations, by using things like mats that allow you to move into different positions during the day. These mats that have, there's one called a topo. I'm standing on one called a kaibun, which was patterned after like the rice paddy fields in South Korea. So it's constantly like making my body shift and move and strengthening my little feet muscles. Treadmills, standing workstations, anything that allows you to stay moving throughout the day. Not necessarily in one single position, right? But just moving constantly. So kneeling, lunging, seated, standing, lying on your stomach, lying on your back, walking, etc. Low-level physical activity all day long rather than sitting. So that's number 2.
Okay.
And that's very important. Number 3 would be at least a couple times a week, you lift something heavy, and at least a couple times a week, you sprint. Doesn't have to be any more than, really, I know some people who do just fine with 1 to 2 times a week. It kind of depends on how quickly you recover, the strength of your nervous system. And what I mean by that is, for example, some people recover more quickly from both a neuromuscular and also a musculoskeletal standpoint from a heavy lifting session or a hard sprinting session. And that's all genetic. You can test your genetics. You can see how many endogenous antioxidants that you make. You can see how quickly you recover. You can look at your fast twitch, slow twitch muscle fiber composition. And you can even use something like heart rate variability to see whether or not you've actually recovered adequately from a hard session. And most folks can handle around 2 heavy lifting sessions and around 2 sprint sessions per week. Now, when I say heavy lifting, that could be building something. It could be a day of gardening. For me, this week, it will be Sunday morning, which was a day that I sectioned a tree with a chainsaw and had to carry about 20 cords of wood or so up to the porch. That took me about 45 minutes of just kind of hauling heavy objects around. And then my second session will be kind of the usual, like tire flipping, deadlifting kettlebells, that type of thing. So it kind of depends on your lifestyle. It can be a combination of chores one day and heavy lifting another day, but generally just subjecting the muscle to an external load.
Right. And particularly, I notice you're talking about larger muscles in the body. This isn't bicep curls. This is deadlifting. This is carrying, probably. Farmers carry, stuff like that.
Yeah, compound lifts through their ability to increase testosterone, growth hormone, increase coordination, increase the number of muscles that you're using at once, so you're a little bit more efficient with the time that you spend doing heavy lifting. And then as far as the sprinting goes, it could be, well, again, to use myself as an example, right? Like I will have one tennis session, which actually took place last night, hard sprinting. I had about a 90-minute tennis match. So that's kind of long. Sprinting session could be something as short as 10 by 100 meter barefoot sprints, or maybe a game of tag with your children, right? Like it's just kind of opening up the body, opening up the lungs, and going anaerobic. Okay. I will have another session later on this week where I'll just be doing some basic sprints on the treadmill. It can be a sporting activity. It can be anything that basically causes you to sprint. It doesn't have to be every day. Again, it doesn't have to be a CrossFit WOD 5 days a week, that type of thing. Now, the final component would be a stamina component. Some people neglect this, but it is true that our ancestors would have had to have engaged in mobility for longer periods of time at a moderate pace, a more moderate pace than you might experience in let's say, a standing workstation or a walking treadmill in your office, right? So we're talking about choosing a day of the week during which you're going to go on a hike or a bike ride, or maybe you're going to go hunting, or maybe you're going to spend the entire day out in the garden working a little harder. So something that challenges you a little bit from a stamina standpoint. So once we put those 4 components together, right? Easy activity in the morning, low level physical activity spread throughout the day. And then we've got a heavy lift and or a sprint session. And by the way, any of those type of sessions ideally should take place at the time of day when post-workout protein synthesis peaks, when body temperature peaks, when reaction time peaks, and that's generally in the afternoon to the early evening. So that means that rather than doing something like that right after a morning fasted fat burning session, you'd do it later on in the day.
Oh, I'm glad to hear you say that.
The afternoon or the early evening. And then maybe you have a weekend long hike, that type of thing. Now, the only change that you'd make to that type of scenario, if you are, say, an athlete, or you want to do an Ironman or a triathlon or a Spartan or something like that, is these sessions become more sport specific, right? So the heavy lifting sessions are going to be structured around the type of lifting you might experience in a Spartan race. Or let's say if you're a triathlete, maybe you'd be doing lots of overhead presses, squats, deadlifts, things along those lines. if you are doing those high intensity interval training sessions, if you're a cyclist, they're probably going to take place on the bike. That weekend stamina session, if you're an obstacle racer, it might, instead of being a hike, it would be lots of burpees, chain drags, tire flips, pull-ups, stuff like that. If you're a cyclist, it'd be a harder bike ride. If you're a triathlete, it might be a swim and a bike and a run all together. But ultimately, sport specificity is going to charge in and start to dictate the nature of some of these sessions if you are an athlete. And that's also where smart programming comes in, working with a coach. It does take a little bit, once you're looking at this from an athletic standpoint, a little bit more intelligent programming than just kind of like the sustainable for life type of program, which is the easy stuff in the morning, low level physical activity throughout the day, couple lifts during the week, couple sprint sessions during the week, and then something long on the weekends.
I love that. And what stands out to me about it is similar to the way I imagine one would advise dietary variety. You're really showing a lot of movement variety, different levels, different intensities, different actual physical movements at different times, different styles. I mean, it seems really a smorgasbord of just different movement patterns throughout your day and throughout your week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And it's always varied. I'm never doing the same session. It's always just all over the place.
I love that. In fact, that's a good segue into the nutritional piece. And I know you're also known for your thoughts on nutrition. Give me a little bit of an idea which kind of nutritional regimen you're following, which you advocate.
I don't follow or advocate anything. I think it's silly because of biochemical individuality and genetic individuality to dig ourselves into saying this diet is right or this diet is right. Instead, I am a fan of looking at someone's activity levels, their goals, their environment, and their genetics, and making nutritional recommendations based on that. So I don't follow a paleo diet or a vegan diet per se, but let me give you an example. Someone who is coming off a standard American diet and who is probably in a situation where they've been consuming lots of pesticides, lots of herbicides, a high amount of omega-6 fatty acids, high amount of potentially inflammatory compounds, and they want to hit the reboot button on their body, or they want to start down the road of becoming healthy, I might start them into, depending on what their liver enzymes look like and what their triglycerides look like and their kidney markers look like, I might start them onto kind of like a vegan juicing type of protocol for a few weeks to kind of clean things up, and then shift them, for example, once we start to introduce more protein and higher amounts of physical activity, I might shift them into something more like a paleo autoimmune protocol. And then eventually, 4 to 8 weeks into that, they would begin eating a wider variety of foods, soaked and sprouted grains and raw milk or fermented milk sources and meats, wild-caught fish, grass-fed beef, things along those lines, more of what we might call a corollary to something like the Weston A. Price diet. So it really varies. It also varies based on genetic individuality. For example, someone from a sub-Saharan African population or say like a Southeast Asian population, they are going to produce higher levels of salivary amylase. They're going to have increased levels of insulin sensitivity. They're going to be able to handle things like citrus fruits and white rice a little bit better than someone from, say, like a Northern European population who's used to fish, salted meats, milks, higher fat compounds, lower carbohydrate, things along those lines.
Interesting.
So it's going to vary widely. Now, I eat about the same thing every day up until dinner. I have a smoothie, a whole bunch of kale and spinach and cilantro and parsley and thyme and cinnamon and vanilla and nuts and seeds and avocado and coconut milk. I shove a bunch of stuff into a smoothie, and that's just easy for me in the mornings. I'm not much of an eggs and bacon guy.
About how many calories is that?
Probably about 1,000.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then for lunch, I'll have a big salad, right? Again, avocados, seeds, nuts, olives, over about anywhere from 4 to 6 different vegetables from the garden, some fresh herbs, some olive oil, maybe some vinaigrette, things along those lines, sometimes some cheese or some yogurt thrown in there. And generally in the afternoon, at some point, kind of like pre-workout-ish, if it's a big activity day, I'll dump a few extra like triglycerides and amino acids into my body by, say, blending in some full fat coconut milk with a little bit of rice protein or pea protein or hemp protein, something a little bit more engineered, I guess, from a fueling standpoint, but something that allows me to sustain energy levels during a workout without a big spike in blood glucose. And then dinner varies. My wife does quite a bit of cooking, so dinner might be anything from salmon cakes with sweet potato fries and roasted asparagus to grass-fed ribeye with some rice or quinoa salad on the side to falafel stuffed pitas with like a barbecue sauce and a side spinach salad. So it varies quite a bit. But ultimately, it's generally the same thing for me every day up until dinner. Cup of coffee in the morning, glass of wine at night, sometimes a cup of tea in the afternoon, and that's generally it.
The eating the same things every day seems to be a pretty strong strategy, not just for discipline, but for kind of eliminating decision fatigue, guaranteeing that you're getting the right nutrients every day. It's kind of once you figure it out, why change it, especially if those are delicious foods that I think people definitely overestimate the amount of variety in their diet, and they end up eating the same things every week anyways. So controlling for those variables and knowing what you're getting seems to be a really winning strategy for just optimizing your nutrition.
Yeah, exactly.
Another thing that I noticed, though, is you're not listing out mangoes and other high glycemic index foods with tons of sugar or fructose. And it seems you're barely consuming any refined carbohydrates until the evening, which I think is telling and very interesting.
Well, it relates to the fact that most of my hard workouts take place in the late afternoon to the early evening. And so I save things like wine or even the majority of my day's carbohydrate load, and similar to something like Dr. John Kiefer's carb backloading approach, until the evening when I'm going to be more insulin sensitive, when most of those sugars are going to be partitioned as storage carbohydrate in the liver or in the muscle, and when I'm a little bit more, shall we say, bulletproof to carbohydrate consumption.
Right. And that has to do a lot with the fat. And I mean, for the audience listening, you want to make sure that those elements of glucose are being put into glycogen and being put into your liver and your muscles and not being stored for excess body fat, I imagine.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on CrossFit? We've mentioned it a couple times. I'm a little bit curious to hear what you think about it.
Sure. As a movement protocol and as an exercise protocol that targets different energy systems, I think it's quite appropriate. I think that overdoing it, doing multiple WODs 5 days a week. For example, I work with a company called Wellness FX where I look at the blood and the biomarkers of a variety of different athletes. And CrossFitters tend to have a high amount of inflammation, thyroid dysregulation, low testosterone, et cetera, that they probably wouldn't have if they were doing something more appropriate in terms of the WODs, something like 3 days a week, for example,
right.
Something closer to what I outlined earlier in our discussion. The other issue that can take place is twofold. Number one, showing up, knowing you need an easy recovery day like foam rolling and maybe an aerobic treadmill walk or something like that, and being pressured by the other folks in the box to join up with the day's WOD, which that can be difficult. And so you need to be aware of that and not succumb to peer pressure in situations like that if you are going to do a CrossFit workout or join a CrossFit box. The other thing is that lifting high loads for time can sacrifice biomechanics. So for example, doing 2-minute max deadlift reps at bodyweight deadlift, by the time you get about 60 to 90 seconds in, you are going to put a lot of stress on the erector spinae. You are going to risk hip flexor strain that can mess with your low back. And so, for example, if I'm going to build a rock wall, right, and I have 50 stones to carry, and each one weighs 80 pounds. I take my friggin' time and I'm placing each rock, I'm lifting it, I'm placing it where it goes, coming back, lifting again. And that's kind of an ancestral form of movement. I'm not going to sprint through and try and build that rock wall as quickly as possible, faster than all the other people, because that will increase my risk of injury. So you just need to be aware of the potential issues. But ultimately, from a movement standpoint, targeting different energy systems, et cetera, the only energy system I think that it neglects would be that energy system of stamina, right? Like, I've competed against CrossFitters in Spartan racing. I've done the SEAL Fit weekend with them, the Navy SEAL kind of like Hell Week equivalent for civilians. And CrossFitters generally can't go for long periods of time very well.
No way.
Once you've exceeded about 20, 30 minutes, their fitness, unless they're supplementing CrossFit with stamina workouts, the fitness isn't all that great.
There are really only 2 WODs that I can think of that last anywhere above 40 minutes. And those are the kind of weird hero WODs that you do once a month or once every 2-3 months. So really, they're not endurance athletes. And I think your point about overtraining is definitely rampant in the CrossFit community. It's kind of a cultural thing that needs to be addressed. Let me ask you this, Ben. What about supplementation? I imagine you have some very strong views on supplementation.
Sure. Yeah, I'll lay this out for you, and then I'm probably going to have to go. But from a supplementation standpoint, again, very similar to a nutrition standpoint, I'm not a fan of a shotgun approach and just using something because someone else is using it. Instead, I'm a fan of testing your blood and your biomarkers by using something like Direct Labs or Wellness FX or Genova Diagnostics or Metametrics, getting stool panels, getting blood panels, getting salivary panels, and addressing your specific deficiencies. Even going as far as to get like a SpectraCell analysis or something like that or an organic acids test for micronutrient deficiencies. And once you've identified what you need specifically, supplementing for you. So let's use myself as an example because I know my body pretty well. If I test during race season, when I'm really beating up my body, I can tell you I probably need a little bit of assistance from an inflammatory standpoint because I'll test high levels of HSCRP. So I might take, for example, a curcumin or curcuminoid extract. And I will probably test for a little bit of thyroid dysregulation due to hypercortisolism from high levels of physical activity. And so I may take thyroid glandular, like a mix of T1, T2, T3, and T4. I will probably test with a little bit of a shift in arachidonic acid and omega-6 fatty acid presence. And so I might throw in good triglyceride-based fish oil or a cod liver oil. And then the other thing that would tend to take a hit would be vitamin D. So I'd take a vitamin D mixed with a good fat-soluble vitamin K and maybe some medium-chain triglyceride oils to allow for better absorption of that. And then finally, if I'm traveling and I'm not eating as many fermented foods as I would at home, I might throw in probiotic, right? And that supplementation scenario might be completely different in the off season when perhaps I'll just stop all of that and use something like a multivitamin mineral complex that just kind of covers my bases during the off season. So it depends.
I see. And really quickly, besides Wellness FX, where can people go to get these tests? I mean, the average consumer and find out what their body does need.
Oh, geez, there's a ton of places. Direct Labs, Inside Tracker, your local physician. You look at the functional medicine practitioner directory or primal physician directory or the Paleo Physicians Network. And you can generally find someone in your community who is willing to go outside the box of conventional medical testing, which would just be like a comprehensive metabolic panel and a complete blood count.
Ben, I know I've taken more of your time than I should today. I really appreciate you making the time. If people want to get in touch with you, listen to your top-rated podcast, check out some of your books, where should we send them?
Probably a good place to go would just be bengreenfieldfitness.com. I do have a really comprehensive book over at beyondtrainingbook.com. But if you go to bengreenfieldfitness.com, you'll be able to get a link to my blog, my podcast. Pretty much everything I recommend is over there. Join the newsletter and I'll keep you posted.
Awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Greenfield, an absolute superhuman. Ben, thank you so much again, and we'll keep in touch.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.